minutes early, so we'll just wait for people to join.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon. Who's that speaking?
How are you?
Professor, nice to see you.
Thank you very much.
This is Neil McCulloch.
Thank you very much. Me too. Thank you very much.
Thank you for joining us.
Yeah. Thank you very much indeed. Yeah.
Is that really Jyoti Parikh I can see there?
Hi. How are
Hi,
you, Andrew?
nice to see you.
Hi. Good to see you after a long time.
A long time, a long time.
Yeah.
I
So
hope you.
what?
I'm,
Is Jan there already?
I'm going to turn my microphone off.
Oh, my microphone is off. Ah.
Professor Parikh, you're most welcome. Lovely to meet you. Hey, Jonathan, welcome.
Hi, how are you?
Yeah, good, thank you.
Good.
So thank you all for joining so punctually. We're just going to wait for a few more minutes. We have 62 people registered for the webinar, which is wonderful. So we're expecting a bit of a rush of people coming in over the next couple of minutes. So just bear with us for another couple of minutes and we'll get going.
Hi, Neil. Can you hear me?
Hi there. Yes, indeed, I can.
Oh, wonderful.
Nice to see you, Sefi.
Nice to see you too. How are you?
Yeah, good. Thanks.
Good.
We're just waiting for a couple more people to join and then we'll
Sure,
get going.
no worries, no worries. I will unmute myself.
Okay, perfect.
Yeah.
Hi, Neil.
Hi, Ryan. Welcome.
How are you doing?
Very well, very well. And that's perfect timing actually, because I think we'll just start getting going now, if that's okay.
Sure.
Um, so welcome everyone to the first part of the Energy and Economic Growth workshop on the political economy of renewables development in Sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia. We're delighted to have you all here. Just a few housekeeping things, which you're all probably familiar with by now from many months of lockdown. So please put your microphone on mute when you're not speaking. Obviously, the use of videos will depend on connectivity. If you wish to raise a question, for those of you who are using video, you can just raise your hand. But if you want to, you can also raise your hand electronically by clicking on the participants feature, and that'll allow you to raise your hand electronically for asking questions. We would also really encourage everybody to use the chat feature. So if you want to comment either during the presentation or to add additional questions during the discussion, then feel free to type those in. We will be monitoring those closely during the webinar. And if, as always happens, there are technical difficulties of one kind or another, then just email Alex Goins. Alex, you want to quickly say hi so everyone knows who you are?
Hi, sorry, yes, I'm busy in the background letting lots of people in. I'm
Okay.
Alex and I'm the business manager at the Top Policy Practice.
Wonderful. So Alex will try and reconnect you if you get disconnected for some reason or another. Okay, so let's get going, and we've got lots of people who are going to be joining us. Alex, could you put the presentation on full screen for me, please? Okay. And that's it. That's great. And next slide, please. Okay, so just a quick overview of what we're going to do today. Just a quick overview. First of all, what we're going to do is have a quick introduction from Ryan Hogarth. Ryan is with Oxford Policy Management, who run the Energy and Economic Growth Programme. And after that, I'm going to give a brief presentation on some ideas about the political economy of renewables. Then what we'll do is we'll have a set of commentators. Alex, if you can, could you move up to the overview slide, slide that gives the overview of what we're doing today? I don't seem to be able to get up there. No, the other way. Then we're going to have a series of commentators. We're going to have some commentators from Mozambique, looking at the political economy of renewables development there. Then, fortunately, we have Abhishek Jain, who's very kindly agreed to give us some commentary from India. And we'll also have some commentary from Jonathan Walters on in the US about disruptive technologies. And then we'll open it up to a general discussion. And at the end, we're going to finish off with some preparatory discussions about what we'd love you all to do in preparation for the second part of the workshop, which will happen on the 15th of July. So without any further ado, I'll pass over to Ryan for some introductory comments. Ryan.
Great, thank you, Neil, and thanks everyone for joining. Political economy, of course, has been a cross-cutting topic throughout the Energy and Economic Growth Program, and I'd like to talk a bit about previous work on the space and ongoing work, as well as why we see it as such an important topic for support from EEG. Two of the foundational pieces of work, the State of Knowledge papers focused on political economy, including Anton Eberhard and Katrina Godinho's paper on the political economy of power sector reform, and Neil McCulloch and John Ward and Esme Sindhu's paper on political economy of foreign aid and power sectors. And since then, we've continued to support work, including a large project being led by Matthew Cotton, Joshua Kirshner, and Daniel Salite at York University on the political economy of electricity access in Mozambique. And information on all these projects and papers can be found on the EEG website. But one area of growing interest is the political economy of renewable energy transitions. As Jonathan Walters highlighted in his recent State of Knowledge paper on disruptive technologies, power systems are now evolving at a pace faster than we have seen for nearly a century. And this rapid shift in technology and economics is leading to numerous emerging political economy questions. And I know that Neil is going to go into more depth into each of these in his presentation, but I'll highlight a few here and how EEG research is tackling them. The first one is because solar is more modular. It has fewer economies of scale, and in many cases, it can more cost effectively meet smaller decentralized loads and national grids. And a shift to decentralization has numerous political economy implications, such as who is responsible for national electrification and meeting targets of universal electricity access, and who can collect profit and rents from those programs. Secondly, decentralized renewables also puts national utilities at risk of losing their wealthiest consumers to grid defectors or to direct purchases of renewable electricity by municipalities or industrial consumers. And one example of this is the ongoing legal dispute between the City of Cape Town and the South African Department of Energy on the legality of direct purchases of electricity by the City of Cape Town, effectively cutting out the middleman. As in every socio-technical transition, regardless of the overall economic benefits, there will be losers. And in this case, those losers include some of the most profitable and politically powerful companies of all time, as well as large numbers of poorer miners that are frequently politically organized. And from South Africa to Indonesia to India, we're seeing that in order for renewable friendly policy reforms to be implemented, in order for them to be politically palatable, they must also be just. And so there's an emerging important area of research around just transitions, which also leads to political questions around how the market for renewables should be structured and how policies like auctions should be designed in order to achieve often two political goals that are often run counter to one another, and that's the objective of low prices as well as the objective of achieving local benefits. And this is a common theme in 2 of the EEG research projects on renewable energy auctions, including the one being led by Anton Eberhard and Vikas Kruger, and a second being led by Wei Shen and Seife Ayele on auctions in Ethiopia. And lastly, there are geopolitical issues at play in transitions to renewable energy. And a growing body of research, including the EEG projects led by Jyoti Parikh's team at Arade, and Ranjit Deshmukh and Kuda Nkudu's team at UC Santa Barbara and SACRI, is showing that international power trade is needed to ensure that large sources of renewable energy are able to serve demand centers, and also to help balance grids with high levels of variable renewables. However, as the paper by Shobhakar Dekal showed, barriers to grid integration frequently aren't technical, but political. And for this reason, EEG has been sponsoring a separate set of climate parliament events, which brings MPs from Africa and Asia together to foster politically viable pathways for power sector cooperation. And so I'll leave it there, but I think the time is ripe for this discussion on how to understand these ongoing shifts in political economy of renewable energy in developing and emerging markets, and I look forward to being part of it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ryan, and what an excellent introduction. What I'm going to do is I'm just going to chat for about 15 minutes with a sort of overview presentation of some of the political economy issues from the policy practices perspective, and then we'll open up to a group of commentators. And briefly, what I'm going to say is that I'll talk quickly about the renewable energy success story, but I'll also lay out a framework for thinking about political economy problems in the energy sector. And then I'll drill down into 3 political economy concepts that I think that we don't perhaps focus on enough, and apply them to renewable energy. And then we can open up with some questions. So first of all, the renewable energy success story. We're having a little bit of difficulty with the slides. Alex, would you possibly be able to move forward? That's great, thank you. So we all know the renewable energy success story. Renewable energy is growing rapidly worldwide. More than 200 gigawatts were added in 2019 alone. There's been an explosive growth in these technologies across the world. So in one sense, this has been a fantastic success. However, if you look at the next slide, you'll see that that success should be tempered by the fact that growth in renewable energy still represents less than 1/3 of overall demand growth. So if you look at total final energy consumption, total final energy consumption between 2013 and 2018 grew from 353 to 378 exajoules. And of that, the vast majority of it is being supplied by fossil fuels and a number of other technologies. Only a very small share is currently being supplied by modern renewables, around about 11% or so. So despite the fast growth in the renewable sector, it still represents a very small share of overall energy consumption. Now, what's the reason for that? Why are renewables not taking over even faster than we than they currently are? Well, there's of course a wide variety of technical reasons for it, and some of them Ryan mentioned. There's issues associated with getting a judicious mix of flexible and dispatchable power, along with other types of power. There's issues associated with redesigning grids so that they can take a greater amount of intermittent power. There's challenges associated with putting in place the necessary demand-side management tools for intermittency. And of course, there's challenges associated with coming up with frameworks for pricing policies which allow you to deal with the breakage of the utility model. But many of the big challenges, as Ryan pointed out, are political. And so what I want to do is I want to focus down on the political economy challenges. Next slide, please. Well, we have huge amounts of evidence now that politics matters for renewable energy development. The World Bank at the end of last year produced an excellent report, Rethinking Power Sector Reform in the Developing World, which has an entire chapter on the political economy of power sector reform, and which draws upon 15 separate case studies which look at the political economy dynamics of reform in those countries. And in addition, as Ryan plugged already, there's several reports which the EEG program itself has produced on the politics and the political economy of renewables. I'll not repeat what he said. So this is a very live area of debate. Next slide, please. One of the challenges, though, which we face with with discussing political economy is that it's a bit of a conceptual muddle. People use the term political economy to mean lots and lots of different things. And so we think we're talking about the same thing, whereas we're actually talking about different things. So, for example, if you talk to foreign policy people, they often, by political economy, mean who's in charge. It's the cut and thrust of the daily politics. You know, what's the minister's view on this, and who's in favor and who's against. On the other hand, some people use political economy just to mean corruption, basically, and rent seeking within the sector. Others use it much more broadly to refer to a set of governance indicators within the sector. So whether or not good governance, as defined by a wide variety of different governance indicators, are correlated with performance of the sector. Still others, again, look at the historical evolution of the institutions and indeed the spatial evolution of inequality and analyze political economy from that perspective, whilst political scientists and microeconomists tend to focus on the microeconomics of elections and the relationship between elections and electrical power. So there's a huge amount of different concepts being squished together, if you like, and as a result we end up with a bit of a conceptual muddle. Now all of these have got their merit, but I thought it might be useful for me to define what I mean by political economy, which is the next slide. What I mean by political economy is as follows. It's how the structures and the institutions of a context and the objectives, incentives faced, and ideas held by the relevant actors influence what is done and therefore the likely evolution of the outcomes of interests, and for that matter, the distribution of the outcomes of interest. Now let's take the latter part of that definition first, the outcomes and the actors. If the outcome which is desired by all of us on this webinar is faster and more equitable renewable energy development, and indeed faster and more equitable use of electricity from renewables, then who are the relevant actors? Well, all of us could come up with a long list of actors, and the usual list of actors includes ministries of energy and regulators and utilities and system operators and IPPs and all that. But you'll notice on this list I've also included several others who we sometimes ignore, not just households who are differentiated in their response to these things, but also political parties, the political leadership of regions and cities and towns, as well as the political economy of donors and foreign countries as well. Next slide, please. Now, for each and every one of these actors, it's possible to delve down into in more detail. First of all, what is the objective of this actor? Secondly, what do they actually have influence or power over? Thirdly, what are the constraints which act upon them? And finally, what are the ideas or mental model that they're using? So I've just picked out 3 actors by way of example. So for example, the head of government, clearly their objective might be national development, but they also have an objective of staying in power, or at least consolidating their consent to rule. They may well have influence over government regulations and actions, but they may be constrained by substantial political opposition and competition, or indeed by elections in democratic contexts. And their idea set can range from anything from very statist to market-oriented, from resource nationalists to a green modernist mindset. Now take independent power producers, particularly renewable energy independent power producers. Their objective is to secure contracts for the construction of renewable energy generation. Their influence may be quite small, but they do their best to build relationships with the key officials. Their constraints may be a regulatory structure that can work against them, and their mindset might be a technological or business-oriented one. Similarly, if you look at donors or foreign governments, their objective might be the achievement of SDG 7, but it might also be getting contracts for their companies. They'll have influence over the flow of aid, but they can't be seen to interfere in domestic politics. And again, their mental model might be one of sort of green recovery post-COVID or something of that nature. My point here is not that this is the right set of analysis, but that analysis has to be done for each and every one of the actors within of the system, within of the constellation, in order to be able to identify what the final political equilibrium is in any particular context. Now, this is therefore an extremely complex problem. Is there some way in which we can simplify it? I think there is, and that is through the focus on 3 particular concepts. Next slide, please. One is the very obvious one of rent seeking in the energy sector. We know that there is pervasive rent seeking all along the energy value chain, from fuel supply monopolies, generation contracts, biased distribution, tariff policies that are biased towards particular groups, metering and billing where you have to bribe somebody in order to get your meter reading reduced and so forth. And that can range from the petty corruption to the grand corruption, although even petty corruption in the literature, it's quite clear, can amount to hundreds of millions of dollars. And the grand corruption isn't necessarily even illegal. If you have a law that says that you've got a fuel supply monopoly, then it's entirely legal that you're going to extract large rents. The key point to bear in mind here is that these rents, because they are large, are a major contributor to political party finances and therefore to the underlying political settlement of many countries, including rich countries, but particularly in developing countries. Next slide, please. The second key characteristic, which we see again and again, is political clientelism. One of the reasons why this isn't focused on so much is that many donor countries typically have politics which is programmatic. That is to say, we argue over the particular programs that ought to be implemented one way or another. But whichever party gets into power will implement that program for everybody. But in many developing countries in particular, politics is highly clientelistic. It's broken down by language, by ethnicity, by region and religion. And politicians are voted in not just to deliver for everyone, but to deliver specific benefits for their base and just for their base. And this has big impacts upon who gets supply and where investment gets made. Next slide, please. And the third key political economy concept I wanted to sort of throw into the discussion was this issue of coordination failures. A new renewable energy supply chain requires extensive coordination between legislators, regulators, financiers, utilities, ministries, private sector. We all know the constellation of actors. But in many cases, that coordination effort requires individual effort by each of those actors. But it only really gains a benefit if they are all working together, and therefore inevitably there's a degree of free riding. That is one of the reasons why donors are very active in the space of trying to solve coordination problems, trying to get dialogues and create research and so forth, including that done by EEG. But it's important to recognize that there are often powerful net losers, and net losers love hiding behind complexity. So something that looks like a coordination failure may not necessarily be a coordination failure. It may well be that people who want to block progress like complexity. Next slide, please. So how do these three political economy concepts apply specifically to renewable energy development? And I think they do because of three specific characteristics of renewable energies. First of all, low variable costs, but high capital costs. Secondly, intermittency. And thirdly, the smaller minimum efficient scale associated with many modern renewables. Next slide, please. So just applying those concepts to those characteristics of renewable energy, I think is quite instructive. Take the low variable costs and high capital costs. We know that renewable energy is just as prone to high-level rent seeking as fossil fuel projects, particularly in things with large capital costs such as wind and dams. But of course, it may be different elites who are able to capture these rents, and that then creates conflict between the potential elites associated with old fossil fuel systems and the newer renewable energy systems. Similarly, on political clientelism, renewable energy has to go where the resources are. But unfortunately, the resources don't necessarily map neatly to political affiliation. And so if the political affiliation of an area differs from that of the ruling elite, projects can either stall or get delayed, or they can be developed in a way that excludes locals. And finally, coordination failures. Ryan mentioned the point that the low variable costs breaks your utility business model, and this is causing great consternation in many countries. And there are big coordination costs about building a new business model that is acceptable to all of the key players. Next slide, please. Now looking at intermittency, a different set of political challenges come up. One of these, for example, is that intermittency can feed into a false narrative about unreliability. I spent a long time in Indonesia, and in Kupang, a city in eastern Indonesia, they built a big solar grid and they plugged it into the grid. As soon as they switched it on, the grid fell over. This has been used by the main electric utility in Indonesia to justify a low investment in renewables ever since, because this stuff is terribly dangerous and you can't protect the grid if you plug too much of it in. Also, there's a very strong grid extension mentality. politicians are very much more keen to extend the grid because they get far more political benefits from extending the grid than they do by improving the capacity of the existing grid to accept intermittent power. And finally, a lot of intermittency problems rely upon increasingly sophisticated demand management. But many politicians in developing countries don't want to manage demand. They're focused on expanding demand. Now, of course, what they really want is to expand the functions, the sales of functions that electricity provides. But utility business models are often based on sales of kilowatt hours and not necessarily on the sales of those functions. Next slide, please. Finally, there are political consequences with lower minimum efficient scale. Again, on the rent-seeking side of things, local political actors now have an opportunity to service local communities, but also to capture the rents. I'm working quite a lot in Lebanon at the moment, and there one town has managed to provide 24/7 electricity to all of its constituents in an environment where, in a country where that is very rare, but in the process is capturing very high rents. Political clientelism also matters because it potentially allows provision for a much wider range of groups. If a local mayor or a local community head can provide for their community, then that's great, but that might not necessarily be what an incumbent elite actually wants. They are previously been in control of who got supply and who didn't. And finally, on coordination failures, local activities may not only not be coordinated with national planning, but in some cases, local entities may not particularly want to coordinate with national planning, and that creates a significant challenge. Next slide, please. So for the discussion, what I suggest is that we focus on 3 questions, and then we can evolve from there. The first question is about the framework that I've outlined, and in particular, the concepts of rent-seeking, political clientelism, and coordination failure. To what extent does this framework capture the political economy challenges associated with renewable energies development, or the things that we're missing or we should be adding? Secondly, because this is drawn out of an EEG research network, it would be great to hear people's views about the most important political economy research questions that we need to answer in order to understand the challenges of renewable development. And then finally, if this political economy analysis or framework for analysis is right, what are the operational implications? And in particular, how should we go about doing things differently to take into account the differing political economy contexts in which we are operating? So to help answer those questions, I'm first of all going to pass over to Daniela Salite and then to Professor Kwamba in Mozambique. Daniela, over to you.
Can you hear me?
Yes, please go ahead.
Oh, okay. Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Daniela from Mozambique. So first, thank you for the presentation. It was really good presentation, and I can say that everything that was said is what is happening here in Mozambique. So I would say that everything has a political purpose. So if you want to implement a project, you have to go through this government tender here in Mozambique. And it's always said that they always know who's going to be the winner. So although they have to go through this process because for matter formalism, but they already know who the winner of this projects are, and they already know how they're going to benefit from all these projects that are being implemented. So in case of renewable energy, so it's still a very new thing here in Mozambique. So although we have hydropower, that it's the main source of electricity, but solar system, there is still very new here in Mozambique, and there is still a lot to be learned. So in general, what I have learned that there is still this lack of clear policies and frameworks about how to develop these activities. And it's always said that there is also lack of governmental incentives to develop this activity. Mostly I can give an example that it says that it's related to taxes. So if you want to implement the project, you still have to pay 7% of import taxes, and on top of that, you still have to pay 17% of VAT. So this, at the end, increase the cost of investment, and also at the end, these costs are obviously transferred to final to pay for all this investment. So I would say that there is no there is no proper environment here to develop the renewable energy, because if you want to develop this, so it will depend of the market. So if there is no higher demand because of the costs, obviously the business or the renewable energy is not going to develop to the extent you want it to develop. So I would say that there is this initiative of providing electricity for all Mozambican people by 2030, but it's not coming with proper regulations and framework about how to do that. So this is one of the main constraints here in Mozambique. So they have solar power plants, but most of them, they're still dealing with this lack of knowledge about how better to implement this new technology, because they still have problem of intermittency. For example, they do not know about the technology. They don't have a proper protocol about how to develop these activities. So this is one of the main constraints here in Mozambique. So
Excellent.
I will pass to Professor Boaventura talking too much about this.
Thank you, Daniela. Professor Kwamba, please, over to you.
And thank you very much indeed, and thank you for inviting me to this workshop. I would like to say first that the technology of renewable energies is developing so quickly that we can say that now 2020, 2021, it is competing with the conventional technologies in terms of course at the generation level. I'm not considering here the issue of accumulation of energy, the use of batteries, because if you consider that, then renewable energies are not yet competitive with the conventional alternative. So I think that we have space to use renewable energy now for many applications. Those applications which do not require batteries. So productive use applications, like for instance, water pumping, in rural areas, grilling of cereals, and so on. So all these applications can take place now at this level of development of renewable energies. So in terms of technology, there are no problems now, but there are problems in terms of political economy. So there are some issues we have to think on. Under such issues, in the context of Mozambique, we have to consider the support for the establishment of the private sector. So far, we don't have also the required private sector in order to disseminate the renewable energies. What we have are public institutions like the Energy Fund, which has been promoting renewable energies in rural areas. But if we think of the 30 million inhabitants we have, it's clear that we cannot reach much through public implementation, but we will need also the private sector to be active so that we can have all these systems in the rural context. Another important issue which should be
Professor
addressed.
Kwamba, I was wondering if you could say a little bit more about the political economy factors that are influencing renewables development in Mozambique.
Sorry?
I was wondering if you could say a bit more about the political economy factors. You've mentioned the technical ones, but what about the political economy factors that are influencing development in Mozambique?
Yes, this is what, in fact, I'm addressing now. It's first of all also the issue of the need to establish a private sector, which can address the implementation of the technologies. Another very important issue is that of subsidies. So we have serious problems with subsidies in Mozambique. Other countries have much more subsidies than we do have in Mozambique. Like for instance, the reduction of import duties, we don't have that in Mozambique. So this is influencing negatively the promotion of renewable energies. So another issue I would like to address in that is the question of definition of tariffs for the off-grid system. If you talk about the injection into the grid, then you have a feed-in tariffs. But if you talk about the implementation of a mini grids, yeah, in rural areas, then you do not have tariffs. So this is a major issue that has to be addressed so that we can have implementation of mini grids in rural areas. Of course, when you talk about the standalone systems, it's not a problem because people buy and own the systems. But if you talk about the mini grids, it's a problem. So we cannot attract the private sector to invest in mini grids without a definition of the tariffs to be applied. So all these are issues to be discussed in the framework of the political economy. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor, and a very important point about different pricing policies for different technologies. I want to pass next on to Jonathan Walters, who's going to need to leave us in about 10-15 minutes, but we're keen to get his views because he wrote a very interesting paper about how renewable technologies can be disruptive. Jonathan, over to you.
Okay, thank you very much, Neil. Good morning or good afternoon, depending on where everybody is. I'm sitting on the east coast of the US. So Neil, I think you make some really, really good observations in your presentation, and you have a really good conceptual framework. So I thought I would just complicate your conceptual framework with a couple of additional observations. Actually, I want to make 3 additional observations. One is, as you mentioned, about disruptive technologies and tipping points, and I'll come back to that in a moment. Second one is about the kinds of scenarios, a sort of typology of scenarios with which different countries seem to adopt and deploy disruptive technologies, including, of course, renewable energy technologies, so scenarios. And the third one is an observation about COVID-19 and about the economic recession or depression that we're moving into, and the recovery that we'll all need from that economic depression, and what that might mean for renewable energy and for disruptive technologies and the political economy of that. And obviously that last set of points is some initial thoughts, because things are moving very fast, but it's obviously extremely topical. So disruptive technology, we should say what the term generally means. It's not just a sort of overall umbrella term for any technology that is changing fast. It's about technologies that pass tipping points, and I'll explain what that means in a moment. That pass tipping points such that suddenly they're everywhere, right? Like smartphones. At one point, hardly anybody had them, and then suddenly hundreds of millions of people had them because they got cheap enough and effective enough. That's a disruptive technology. That's a tipping point. Now, when we look at the power sector in particular, and renewables in particular, we can distinguish that there are 2 levels of tipping point. So let me illustrate this with an example very quickly. So let's compare, say, a coal-fired power plant with a power plant that is renewables plus some form of energy storage, such that it produces electricity with the same kind of time profile as a coal-fired power plant, so that it's basically dispatchable or base load or flexible or whatever you want to call it. So you compare these 2 things, the economics of these 2 things, the coal-fired one and the renewables plus storage. So there's a first tipping point, which is when you're considering investing in a new plant, you find that the renewables plus storage one, in whatever place you're in, has become cheaper than the coal-fired one, and you decide you'll invest in the renewables plus storage one instead of the coal-fired one. So for new investment, that's a tipping point. That makes some difference to the set of technologies you use in that country, in that society, but it's always a difference that's sort of shifting at the margin. Right? The second tipping point, which is much more revolutionary, is when the renewables plus storage plant in my example, and when I say plant, it could be a centralized plant or a group of decentralized service providers. But when that becomes not just cheaper than a new coal-fired power plant, but it becomes cheaper than continuing to operate an existing coal-fired power plant. In other words, it's cheaper than buying the coal, to put it in a simple way. That's really revolutionary, because suddenly you decide, okay, actually I would like to retire all my coal-fired power plants early, shut them down, even if they've got some technical life in them, and replace them with renewables plus storage. That's a more revolutionary tipping point, the second tipping point. And it's important to emphasize that it's not just the set of technologies that you're disrupting. You're disrupting all the institutions that plan and implement those technologies. You're disrupting a lot of vested interests who feel very threatened by this change in economics with the tipping point. You're disrupting the incentives you were talking about in your presentation. You're disrupting mindsets and ideas that people have about how the power sector should operate. So disruptive technologies disrupt an awful lot of things that have very political economy implications. So that's my first observation. Second observation is based on a very good paper that was done for the World Bank by Michael Leifman a couple of years ago. And he tried to distinguish different types of scenarios which describe how different countries adopt and deploy disruptive technologies, including renewable energy technology. And all three scenarios begin with the letter L to make them memorable. And maybe by coincidence, it's the beginning of the name of the author, Michael Leifman. So he had three scenarios. He had the leapfrogging scenario, in which a country changes its technologies very, very fast. So smartphone is a great example again. Countries moving from, remember those old-fashioned landline phones that we all used to have, and then suddenly, people leapfrog to smartphones. That's the idea of leapfrogging, and you can see examples of that in electricity and in renewables. So leapfrogging is one end. A whole country leapfrogs to a new set of technologies. The other end of the spectrum is you get locked in. For various reasons, mostly political economy reasons, countries are locked into their old way of doing things, and the new technologies, the disruptive technologies, are hardly getting a look into the process. And then in the middle, between the leapfrog and the locked in, you have what he called the lopsided scenario, in which parts of your economy are leapfrogging and large parts of your economy are sort of semi-locked in, and so you get this imbalance. And I think we can all think of examples of technologies in electricity or otherwise, and countries that are like that, and there are usually going to be political economy factors that help to explain that imbalance, that sort of lopsidedness. So that's a set of concepts you might want to think about adding to your framework. Now, my observation about COVID-19. I think what we've seen in the period of lockdown in many countries is that technology change and investment in new and disruptive technologies has been a little bit frozen, or maybe just very slowed down, because so little investment could really be taking place, either for financial reasons or just logistics reasons, or falling electricity demand, or whatever the factors are. Things have been a bit frozen. But when countries move into the recovery phase from the economic depression that's been triggered by the lockdown for COVID-19, when they move into that recovery phase, they will want to unfreeze technology change as fast and effectively as possible, because they were in a process of technology change, and they'll want to resume it. And maybe the recovery will be best focused on accelerating technology change instead of locking in old technologies. But then you're going to have a kind of international political economy issue, which is that many countries will need development aid in order to do that acceleration of the deployment of disruptive technologies. And the big issue right now, I think it's being much discussed, and I lost count of the number of webinars and online conferences I've attended recently on this. The big issue is whether those development aid flows are going to be there on a scale that corresponds to the level of the problem that developing countries are going to be facing coming out of the lockdown, coming out of the depression and going into recovery. And I think that's going to have huge implications. The level of development aid, I think, is going to have huge implications for the pace of technology change in renewables. So let me stop there.
Thank you very much, Jonathan. Very thoughtful set of responses. Abhishek, I'm keen to hear from South Asia and whether or not India is leapfrogging, lopsided, or locked in, and whether the political economy concepts that we were discussing earlier are relevant to renewables development in India. Abhishek, over to you.
Yeah, thanks, Neil. I hope I'm audible. Great to see a lot of familiar faces and friends here, especially some after a long while. Maybe Neil, just before I jump into some of the perspectives from our experience in India, I just wanted to say, I think the overall framework seems like we are latching on to some of the emerging themes very well. But I guess, especially on the intermittency bit, the themes that you discussed were not necessarily still using the three pillars that we were looking at, whether it was rent seeking, whether it was political clientelism, or the coordination problem. So I guess we probably need to expand this building upon what we already have. Now, sort of just reflecting on the existing three pillars and how some of the developments in India are looking like. So if I just pick the first one, rent seeking, right? I guess there are three levels at which this gets illustrated in interesting ways in India. One, of course, is the big debate between coal versus renewable, which I think more and more in India is actually a debate of coal and renewable rather than coal versus renewable, because especially with the last moves, which some of you might have tracked over the last couple of weeks, India announced big plans to further enhance the coal deployment in terms of expanding the mining capacity in the country, primarily trying to reduce the imports, rightly so, I mean, because that's a significant outlay in terms of our fiscal expenditure that goes towards, or rather not fiscal, but sort of say the international expenditure that we are having on importing international coal. So there is one, and within that, if you see, if you look at who are the major players emerging, India's largest thermal power producer, private sector thermal power producer, is also the largest market capital valuation wise, the largest company in the renewable space in India, right? So you see that, I would not necessarily want to qualify it as rent seeking, but you see the similar big players also moving into from thermal, or rather simultaneously playing in the two spaces, right? And then you also see, apart from the coal and renewable, if you start looking at how renewable itself is getting deployed in India, there again you see large systems getting much significant priority or government impetus than the smaller systems. So decentralized renewable or rooftop deployment, so to say, are at about 2.5 gigawatt in India, compared to large-scale solar deployments, where we are looking at almost 32, 33 gigawatt. So it's more than a factor of 10 difference there that we see. Even though the policy mandate or the government program mandate is to sort of look at both in by and large at the same order of magnitude, we see almost entire difference in magnitude when it comes to implementation as of now. And here again, I guess some of those rent-seeking behaviors possibly might have a role, but also I will come to a couple of other points which may be leading to this. And third, and this is also something we have seen in the recent months, even when we are looking at decentralized renewables, as some of you might be knowing that India is one of actually the largest deployer of solar water pumps anywhere in the world. We already have about 270,000 solar water pumps, primarily for irrigation. But now the plans are to deploy them in millions. And as part of that, some of the tenders that are now being rolled out are primarily for large-scale manufacturers of solar panel. So in some ways, you're also again trying to more focus on larger players rather than the smaller players, even if the deployments are going to happen in a decentralized fashion. So I think this is something worth at least reflecting on as part of this discussion. When we look at political clientelism, I think, I guess the way we have defined it so far in the discussion, probably I don't see it a sort of one-to-one mapping in the Indian context, but I think it's more related to sort of political narratives which are being sort of adopted or are being popularized in the country based on your political affiliations. So even if they are not, let's say, necessarily related to policy and programs, they are related to the general agenda of development. So if the general narratives are more leaning towards large scale, big, rapid, swift deployments, you end up favoring more large scale deployments rather than the decentralized deployment, so to say. So I think that's also in some way a following of the popular narrative, but not necessarily the way we have discussed in terms of whether it is a religion, a caste or region, and so on and so forth. On the coordination bit, actually, I think this is a real one. I mean, and probably not just true for India, but also for many other countries. In many ways, we are looking at an electricity system in terms of its market dynamics, which is archaic because of the kind of technologies that it was catering to. I mean, we were mostly having predictable power supply. Your supplies were a lot more in control compared to what we now see because of the renewables coming into picture. And your tariffs were far more simply designed. I mean, you usually had only two-part tariff, a fixed cost and a variable cost. Whereas now, if you look at how the new age technologies are coming in, not just renewables, but also, as Walter said, many other technologies, including storage, etc., which are also bi-directional interactive with the grid. You're not just consuming, but you, as a consumer, if you are having a storage, you can also provide a service back to the grid. I think there the existing market design does not really cater to the new age technologies to come in. And you need to shift in a significant way, just like the technology is leapfrogging, you need to leapfrog your market design in order to accommodate these new technologies effectively. What we're right now doing is what I call usually a band-aid solution. Some of you might be aware of the net metering policies that India has, right? Where if one is sort of deploying solar rooftop on their premises, the equivalent amount that they are generating from the solar, the bills get shaved off by equivalent amount of units, irrespective of when you are generating that and when you are consuming that energy, right? So the whole idea of intermittency actually just is getting taken care by the grid, whereas the consumer right now is just directly availing the benefit. Now what happens is, especially in India where you have higher tariffs, again, partly a political economy issue, where you have higher tariffs for industrial and commercial consumers, and then they start putting rooftop solar on their premises, DISCOMs actually lose out, or the distribution companies are losing out some of the highest paying consumers and some of the most reliable consumers, so to say, when it comes to revenue generation. And that's why you see a lot of opposition, or at least not as much support from the DISCOM coming in, just because you have not tried to solve the problem at a fundamental level, and you're sort of trying to do band-aid solutions on top of a system which cannot really sustain itself for long, the existing market structure, so to say.
Yeah.
So I think I'll probably just sort of pause there in terms of reflection on all three pillars, so to say. But certainly, I think there is a scope for us to expand these and look at a few other dimensions of political economy as well. Yeah.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Abhishek. Fascinating set of reflections. We're a bit low on time now, so I wanted to bring in Yoti Parikh, who's kindly put her electronic hand up for a question, and then Zainab Usman also had a question. Yoti first.
Yeah, hello, Neil. That was an excellent presentation, well laid out all the concepts. I was just wondering, 2-3 small issues. Where do you put the pure and simple barriers like capacity building, knowledge management missing, small financing availability? Are they also political? Because, you know, so far the commercial energy is a big business with large finances, large, highly technical fields. And that's one thing. But also that I'm coming to the next point about gender. For the whole the entire century of conventional energy has not seen gender representation in a big way in the energy sector itself. And then you wonder whether it is because this is a highly technical field, and so far there were not that many engineers and so on. But could it improve? And if so, this is something that we have to start planning right now, so that they are in part of the energy management system. And third is, I mean, in a sense, when we say what are the political problems of economic problems of renewable, but renewable itself is trying to enter through that route, because suppose you say I need a intermittent free affordable energy. It does not always come in every matter, but we want to now our agenda of environmentalist and climate friendly people. But is it everybody's agenda? Okay.
Thank you very much, Jyoti. And I'll respond to your question, but I'm keen to get in as many people as we possibly can. Zainab next, and then Anton, you also had your hand up.
Right. That's a good one.
Yeah. Hi. Good morning. Thank you very much for the very interesting presentations. I think I really like the framework. It's very clear, I would say, and very relevant. So I have two questions or comments, and I'll make them very, very brief. So the first is on concepts. So the concepts of rent-seeking, but particularly political clientelism, and the way that particular concept is framed, I think I would urge us to really think about that carefully, because, you know, on that slide, it's written that donors typically have programmatic politics, but in many developing countries, their politics are clientelistic. I think, you know, given a lot of what we're witnessing in the last couple of years, particularly for us who live here in the US, I don't know if I would completely describe the politics of the US currently as it is as programmatic. So I think I would really urge us to think about that carefully. And
I thought I might get in trouble with that statement.
Yeah. And, you know, I was just reading Francis Fukuyama the other day. He has a book, Political Order and Political Decay, and there's a chapter there in which he extensively talks about political clientelism in Southern Europe, particularly. I don't want to mention specific countries. You can look up the book yourself. So I think clientelism is a very, very important concept to think about, but we need to think about how we frame it, and, bearing in mind, these dynamics. The other thing on concepts is, and what I thought was missing is, structural attributes in countries. And structural attributes, you can go the whole hog, whether it's, population, geography, but very, very important for this topic is resource endowments. So, it could be the case in a particular country, and again, I don't want to mention specific countries here, that have coal deposits, right? They have coal deposits. They don't have a lot of savings, whether in terms of pension funds or other such resources to embark on a large renewable energy project. And then suddenly, the priority is we want to invest in coal-fired power plants. That could be a reason why policymakers behave in certain ways and might want to obstruct renewable energy investment. And this is just one of various examples on this area. So it's really something to think about in terms of how to incorporate structural attributes. And it's the classic structure agency problem, right? On which one tends to predominate. So very quickly on the second point, which is on research questions, and specifically for this is, I felt so far in the presentation, although a couple of commentators kind of alluded to this, I didn't see a lot of emphasis on geopolitics. And on that, I mean two things. One is thinking about the diffusion of technology, technological know-how, intellectual property rights, and then very important investment flows. So when you look at renewable energy technology, whether it's components for solar energy, you find that increasingly the know-how is located in certain countries, including China, including Germany, right? So what does that mean for technological know-how? What does that mean for the countries that are at the receiving end of these investments? Would there be risks of stranded legacy technology around even these renewable technologies? Because when you look at solar energy, the solar panels that are in use today are very different from the ones that were in use, 15, 20 years ago. And finally, very quickly, the discussion on perhaps multilateralism and the fact that maybe we're moving away from a multilateral global order, and what does that mean for consensus on key issues like the energy transition and climate change. And of course, we all care about climate change, but the hard reality is that there's a lot of bleeding heart, hand-wringing, more than concrete action taking place around climate change. And concrete action needs to be taken, but if we're moving towards a global order in which there's less and less multilateralism, what does that mean for the energy transition and renewable energy investments? Thank you very much. Sorry.
Fabulous. Fabulous. Thank you very much, Zainab, for excellent contribution. And for those of you who haven't read it, I recommend Zainab and Alan David Lee's wonderful literature review, which they did as part of the Rethinking Power Sector Reform project. It's published on the World Bank site and is a great read. I'm going to give the last question to Anton, and then I'll quickly respond, and then we should move on to the steps which we're hoping to prepare for the next webinar on the 15th of July. Anton, over to you.
Yeah, so thank you for a really interesting webinar. Great introduction, Ryan, and really interesting presentation, Neil. I think this area has huge potential, and Ryan made mention of an earlier paper that Katrina Godina, an ex-PhD student of mine, and I did around a political economy framework. And I think just taking us back there, it had 4 key elements to it, which map somewhat in the framework that you've given, Neil. So the first was interests expressed by actors or coalitions of actors, which could either be material or political. So maps onto your political clientism or rent-seeking, advancing material interests. But how will those interests advance? Primarily through trying to build institutions, either formally or informally through networks. And to the extent to which they're successful is the extent to which they have access to power, again, de jure or de facto in networks. And then the interesting element to which the fourth element, right? So interests, institutions second, power third, the fourth area around ideas or ideology, the way in which they legitimize or delegitimize their ideas. And that, what interested me in what you did was the specific characteristics of renewables and how they play into this. So for example, intermittency and the way in which ideology and ideas are used to either legitimize or delegitimize. So I really encourage you to take this work forward. I think is a rich area of research that has huge implications for our own contests, because this energy transition is being highly contested, and we need to understand the way in which political economy plays out in our own environments. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much, Anton, and thanks for referring back to that nice framework. And there was a nice comment by Johannes Palanin before he left, that what we don't lack is frameworks. What we lack is the ability to apply them to context, which is a very nice point. Just quickly to respond to Yoti's questions and Zainab's questions, and then I'm going to pass over to Alex to talk about the next steps for the workshop. Yoti, you're absolutely right to point to the typical challenges of capacity building, financing, and so forth. But those are what I would call the bread and butter, if you like, of renewable energies development. It's what we always talk about, and they're absolutely essential. The focus here was really to try and drill down a little bit more on the political economy elements. So I wouldn't consider them political economy elements, except insofar as the provision of them may well be politicized. Zainab, I really liked your comments. Thank you so much for them. On political clientelism, I knew I was going to get stick for that. The key point I wanted to get here is that quite often donors will come along with the assumption that a government is committed to renewable energies development, and indeed committed to renewable energies development for everybody. And that assumption is not true in the developing world, and it's not true in rich countries either, as we have seen. So you're quite right, political clientelism applies to all countries, but it's just getting over the idea that there is some generally beneficial attitude taken by the government is not necessarily the case. And finally, on your comments on structures, you'll be glad to hear that the political economy analysis framework, which is used by the policy practice, and indeed very similar to the one which is used by Anton, or which Anton talked about, starts with the structural issues, which I think are absolutely critical, and then the institutional issues. And they were there in my definition, but I focused just on the actors and their incentives and interests and ideas. But you're absolutely right, that's a key part of it. So unfortunately, we're out of time. But there will be opportunities for not only for us to have one-way dialogues, but to have multi-way dialogues on the 15th of July, because we're planning a slightly longer session in which you'll all get to talk to one another and not just to me. Alex, I'm passing over to you to explain what it is we're hoping to do.
Thanks, Neil. All right, thank you everyone for your patience. I know we've run out of time a little bit, so I shall be quick. So the next webinar is going to be on the 15th of July at 2 o'clock. So I will shortly share with you another link to that. And it's going to be a virtual poster session. So it's going to be a chance where you can all share your work and discuss areas around the political economy factors that might influence this. So a fun way of doing this would be for people to create a short 3-minute video, scripted but casual, around this topic. So what we'd like you to do is to record a video either on your laptop, tablet or phone, loosely based on a script written beforehand, which will then be uploaded to a Dropbox that I will share with you and put onto a YouTube channel that will only be available to you, the participants of this webinar. So nothing will be shared outside of this. So the key words there really are, it is meant to be casual, so please don't worry too much about this if you haven't done one similar. Let me just change my slide. So it's going to be based around these 4 problems, 4 questions. What is the problem or question that your research addresses? What types of political economy problems affect the issues that you're studying, and how do they do so? What are the most important research questions that we need to answer to help understand the political economy challenges to renewable energy development better in your context? And finally, what are the main policy or operational implications of the political economy problem that you have encountered? Now remember, it's only for 3 minutes. So prepare a short script or bullet points before you start recording will help. We recommend doing it on either a tablet, a laptop, or an iPhone. I'm sure you've all made videos on phones before. I personally find that the easiest way, but you can also do it on your laptop. You'll then upload it to a Dropbox account, and I will put it onto this private YouTube channel. If you can do this by the 9th of July or earlier, that would be great, because that gives me a lot of time to get them all uploaded. So as I said, and I really want to reiterate, these are private. It is a private channel. It won't be viewable by others. So there's no need to make sure that it's word perfect. It's just for us to share. If you don't feel comfortable doing a video, there is an option of doing a PowerPoint presentation with a voiceover. So this can be done in PowerPoint by going to the slideshow and just pressing record slideshow. I'm sure many of you have done this as backups. Try not to use too much text on the slides or to read directly from the slides. Try using interesting graphics and photos to highlight your story. Again, if you prefer to do this, then email me and I will let you know details of how we can get it over to me and shared with the others. So when we come back on the 15th of July, we'll have this virtual poster session. This is a facility on Zoom which allows participants to chat to others in small groups about the videos and PowerPoints that have been posted. So I hope as many of you as possible can try to attempt to do a video for us. If you've got any questions, please let me know. I'll be sending out these instructions as well by email. Yeah, fingers crossed we get some good, interesting videos or PowerPoints from you. Thanks, Neil.
Thank you. Thank you, Alex. And just to say, please do try and do a video, because it's really easy. In the 10 minutes prior to this webinar, I did a 3-minute video on the political economy of renewables development in Indonesia. It's only us that's going to see it, so you don't need to make it perfect. Actually, I did 2, because I did one for 4 minutes and then I realized I ran on too long and had to do it again. So please do try and make those videos. Please try and ensure that you've done them by the 9th of July. That's a week from today. I recommend you finish this webinar now and go and do it straight away. And the reason for that is because we want to give people time to review all of those videos before we come and have the virtual poster session in which we chat to one another on the 15th. So please try and get them done by the 9th of July. And it only serves me to thank you all for joining. The fact that we still have 40 participants at the end of more than an hour of webinar, I think speaks well to the caliber of the contributions which you've all made. And we really appreciate you joining us. We'll see you on the 15th. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thanks very much, Neil.
There, I pushed the last turn to the waiting room.
Good. Sorry it ran over.
Oh, it could be. And it's such a shame. It could, you know, there just wasn't enough time for the interesting debate. And I'm sure there could have been so much interesting debate. Such a shame.
I mean, we had yeah, so many good people on that thing. But I'm glad we picked the people to speak, because unfortunately, Daniela and Professor Kwamba weren't so great, but everybody else had really interesting things to say.
Jonathan, who's Jonathan Walters then? He sounds very interesting.
He is great. He's great. He's a real thinker. I had to try and speed him up so we could get Abhishek in, and who was also really good. And I'm really glad that Anton actually came in and did a little bit of a plug. And Zeynep, you know, posed a few questions.
Yeah.
Okay. Well done. Thank you, by the way.
Yeah, I don't know what happened with the slides. I'm not sure, but I wasn't able, because I had everyone arriving at the same time. I wasn't able to change the slides at the beginning, so it was one of those.
Yeah.
I think my whole.
I think that I think it might be better next time if we do something like this, if you just control the slides, and then we don't bother sharing the screen, because I imagine that creates extra bandwidth issues.
Well, the only problem was when I couldn't let people in and control the slides at the same time.
Yeah.
So I was having to.
Yeah,
so
yeah, exactly. No, I could tell you were like frantically. Okay, come in. I mean, one thing is, we always use the host, but I'm wondering for some of these big things like this, whether we need to just risk the possibility that, you know, we just let people join, because it does create a bit of a crush at the beginning when you have to let people in. Yeah.
Unless you have somebody else. Oh, we could just give co-host to somebody, one of the, you know, our friendly participants, to let people in. Like Laura Len could have done that, couldn't she?
Yeah, yeah.
I
didn't see Laura Len on the list. Did she join?
Yep, she joined. Yeah.
Okay.
At the most, we had 50. I'll have to work out the list of who it was, but I took photos of the screen so I could mark down who arrived. But yeah, most we had 50. The least we had was 40. So.
Is there some way of downloading the chat as well?
I was just going to copy and paste it.
If you wouldn't mind, that'd be great, because Johannes and Alan, David Lee made some really interesting points, and then Andrew's got a nice point as well, and so does Chris Beaton and Anish. So, well, Anish is just a thank you, but so that would be really helpful. I'll send around a thanks to the speakers or the commentators for their efforts. I'm also conscious that we half lined up Morefu and then we didn't give him a chance to speak, so I'll apologize for that. Although he arrived late, so it's his own fault.
And I will send out the instructions to everybody.
Great.
and send out the Dropbox link as well. And hopefully people are very enthusiastic generally, so hopefully there'll be a few people who want to do videos.
Yeah. I thought it was really interesting, and you know, we began to converge upon a sensible conversation towards the end. It would have been a bit all over the place to begin with, and I was thinking, oh crikey, this is going to go in too many different directions. But then it began to sort of come together, and then we ran out of time. We will have a little bit longer next time round, so let's think a little bit about the best way we might use this.
Yeah.
We also will need to see
Yeah.
what videos people provide, and then work out what the breakout groups will be.
Exactly. So let's wait till next week to see what the kind of response is.
Yeah.
I'll send out another calendar invite and see if anybody says no, sorry, can't make it, and then I'll get better. I mean, we're down what? There was meant to be 64 in total, and we got 50. So there's 14 people who didn't join this one. I'll still send in the email.
I think that's a fantastic performance. You know, EEG should be happy. I'm really pleased. My slight worry is everyone will say, okay, well, I'm a bit busy. I can't bother doing the video. And, you know, I kind of get the basic drift of this now. So we might not get the same numbers for the 15th, but we'll see. I would love you. Go ahead.
So if we have to change the format because we only get 2 videos, we do. There seems to be plenty of you know, things to discuss.
Yeah.
I'm going to start recording.
No, I agree. Well, we can always think of a panel or something if we don't.
Yeah, and also whether we want to do anything eventually with the